Bismillah. In alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Thank you for coming here, brothers, sisters and friends. Today we have a very unique topic given by a very unique speaker, and it's on the topic of why, if God is merciful, why is there suffering? I'm sure you don't have to look far to kind of reflect upon this question. You look at the news and we see suffering there in its many forms present, whether that's killings or deaths in Palestine, the loss of loved ones in our own immediate family. Suffering is essentially a fact of life. But then one poses the question, why, or rather, how could an all-merciful God want or allow this suffering to happen? And this is kind of what the MSA, the Muslim Students Association, wants to unpack with our speaker today. Our speaker is Faraz Nomani. He is a public speaker, activist and consistent student of knowledge, Islamic knowledge. He graduated in a degree of economics and law and studies the Islamic sciences with specific interest in the Quran, having memorized it in its entirety. He also studies Islamic theology, law and Arabic. He speaks on a range of issues related to Islam and regularly participates in debates with atheists, theists and academic voices. He has debated at the national level and has a keen interest in polemics and epistemology. Without further ado, the MSA would like to present Faraz Nomani.
Thanks for that. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take up the lectern. I figure it's easier to speak from. And it'll make it easier to look at the screen as well. I think can everyone hear me okay? Should I turn this thing on? What do you think? Fine? Everyone? People at the back? Cool? Right. Beautiful. Okay. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man wala. Firstly, thank you very much to MSA UNSW. I think, UNSW MSA. Keep getting the name the other way around. It's changed, more than we changed our underpants. So, so I want to thank the MSA for inviting me. UNSW MSA is very, very close to my heart. I'm an alumni of this MSA in this university indeed. I think I used to have classes in this lecture hall once upon a time as well. So it's great to come back and see how things have changed. The campus is unrecognizable. You have things like Oliver Brown on campus, which is madness. I mean, and Subway. I'm not sure. I don't think even we had Subway back in the day. So it's great to see the changes, and of course that the flame of Islam is burning very positively, alhamdulillah, on campus. So well done to all of you, the Muslim students anyway, on your efforts in organising these sorts of events, and to our non-Muslim guests who are here with us. I hope you find these engagements fruitful and take a lot away and gain a lot of insight and knowledge and information about Islam. I mean, Muslim students hold these Islamic awareness campaigns and weeks across the different universities to create a dialogue and discussion around Islam, which, let's face it, is a pretty contentious issue. And the hope is that there is positive engagement to come out of events like this. So I've been given an interesting topic. If God is merciful, why is there suffering? Look, it's important to contextualize any discussion that's being had. I think that adds fruit and it adds to a richer discussion. Now, this is a very, very common contention when it comes to God. There's a subgenre of literature in America, for instance, where the storyline goes somewhere along the lines that parents driving, had a car crash, kid died, they stopped believing in God, and then the story goes. It's a bit like the Bollywood equivalent, guy meets girl, struggle with parents, get married happily ever after. There's an entire subgenre of literature that revolves around this problem. And in many other areas of society, you'll constantly hear reference to this. And I think it's worth acknowledging for a moment that we must, those of us who believe in God, must have empathy with this line of thinking as a starting point. Because, let's face it, sometimes life is difficult. Or in fact, a lot of the times, life is difficult. It is tough. There are difficulties. It is hard to get through. It doesn't matter what your material condition is. It's just a fact of life. Things happen. Things happen sometimes very suddenly. Change the course of people's lives. And so hardship and suffering is not easy to contend with. And if you've got an unrefined thinking of God, or it's something that you haven't given a lot of thought to, then it can easily, go along the lines that we will explore in a moment. This concept of the problem of evil, that the very existence of evil is problematic. So it's worth acknowledging that, and I think it's important to start from that empathetic departure point. It's not a case where people are, just doing anything to, adhere to their whims and desires by not wanting to believe in a God and finding excuses. I think sometimes it is very genuine, and it is something that, in order to connect on this topic with others, it's important to acknowledge. And there's two, broad contextual influences, I suppose, in our day that might lead one to this direction. I suppose at the more macro level, when we take a step back to see where we are in human history at the moment, and just really in just over the last century, there have been catastrophic world wars. We get to hear and see a lot about them in our schooling and in the documentaries. If you're a YouTube documentary geek, it's very easy to see that there's been a lot of suffering and hardship in the world in the last little while. On the scale of human history, the last moment of history has been very tough, notwithstanding our very unprecedentedly easy material and physical conditions that we find ourselves in 21st century Australia. So it's been tough, right? And anyone who cares about history or politics will see that it's tough. And it's not just the case that it was tough in the past, it's still tough in most places in the world. And you don't have to look very far to find that. So that's like the context of world history in which we can see the difficulty that humanity has faced in recent times. And then more immediately, I think, in the last sort of 10 to 20 years, given where we are, is this birth and growth of the new atheist movement. This really militant approach towards religion, which is really quite passionate in denigrating any concept of belief, and in pointing out how much hardship exists and how could a God let this happen? One of those sort of Nelson type the Simpsons sort of jibe type comments that the new atheists make, and that's a bit of an unsophisticated engagement with the topic, but that's what we face. A lot of people at university or who are young, they come across arguments on the internet or videos, and all of a sudden, they think they've figured out some existential problem with world religions because there's a bit of suffering around the world. So, and the new atheists really they pumped along the likes of Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and so forth. So, and they should be exposed. They're just a bunch of hypocrites. They're not worth the time of day. But it should be acknowledged that their arguments have gained a currency, right? So there's this understandable side of this argument, which is, the suffering at a macro and human level, the difficulties that people have in their everyday life, and then there's like these people jibing from the side with crappy arguments, which should not be given the time of day. So that's what brings us to this particular topic. But what is this question really getting at? I think David Hume, the great English, it's relative, but the English philosopher / scientist, whatever you want to call him, it was all one and the same back in those days. No one had any professions. He said, if God is willing to prevent evil but unable, then he is impotent, meaning he's not able. He lacks power. If he is able but not willing, then he is malevolent, meaning he's got ill will, right? Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? Meaning, if he's able and willing to stop it, but he doesn't, then he's just pure evil, right? And that was David Hume back in, I think, the 18th century, maybe even the 17th. So the point to note from here is that this argument has been around for a while, and at its core, that's what it is, right? If you distill it and you break it down a little bit, it's really quite simply this, that, on the one hand, all religions will tell us that God is merciful, right? They want us to believe that God is merciful and, he loves his creation and so forth. But on the other hand, life is miserable for most people, right? There's war, there's children, they suffer for no apparent reason, born with all sorts of conditions, and there's also great disparity between people. Just based on the pure chance, let's go with the argument for the time being, the chance of where they're born, for example, right? So why is life so harsh and difficult for the the child born in sub-Saharan Africa versus the privileged white kid born in Wallara or something like that, right? Why? What did they do to deserve such different lives? Why is there such disparity, right? So that's what the argument is really getting at. And so the question begs itself: why does God need this? Why does God need for people to go through this? Why? Like, if He was merciful, why couldn't He just create happiness for everyone and let that be the way that the world functions? So this is what the question is getting at. And at a surface level, it seems to have some punch, right? I'm sure at some level in our lives, we have all thought about this question. We have all thought, yeah, you know what? Why does God need for that to happen? If He's all powerful, if he knows everything, if He's got everything, why does He need His little minions to be going through difficulty? The minion happens to be me. Like, why? So that's at an intuitive level, the argument seems to have some pull. But what is the problem with this question? What is the problem with this question? Obviously, we'll break it down, and then we'll break down, the assumptions, and we'll build the Islamic understanding on top. It's full of hidden assumptions, right? And it puts the cart before the horse, as the saying goes. What we really need is a framework for breaking down such questions, and at each point we need to check our sources of knowledge. Right? As with many other questions around God, this is a question about the sources of knowledge. How do we go about finding things out? How do we go about constructing our worldview? How is that done? And at the heart of this question is really what we call epistemology, right? Which is exactly what I've just mentioned. How do we gain knowledge, and how do we make conclusions about the nature and attributes of things, about the way things are, whether it's God or otherwise? And so, what we need to ask ourselves is, how do we go about deciding normative questions, such as what is justice, such as the concept that God should be merciful. Now, if you take a step back, these are normative questions. They're value-laden comments. They're value-laden statements. They have some value to them. Justice is not something that, it's not something they just wake up one day and know. It's not like, for instance, the sky is blue. Okay? That potentially is an objective fact, right? But justice isn't. What is justice for one person, or in one person's viewpoint, could be something entirely different in another person's viewpoint. So these are things that need some sort of a framework for us to achieve some sort of conclusion on, to come up with some sort of understanding on as to what these things are. And statements that should be merciful or is not merciful. What does that mean? What does merciful mean anyway? Right? One person's mercy is another person's everyday life. So how do we go about understanding that? And so I want to take a moment just to segue into a specific element of this, and that, of course, is the place where you'll hear this argument most these days. And I'm not talking here about, as I mentioned, the well-intended people who see suffering around the world, who see difficulty, and they ask this question. I want to have a bit of a go at the Milton Atheists, because they seem to sometimes have a disproportionate influence on even well-intended people who end up asking questions like this, not taking into account the significant contradictions that go into the atheist worldview, right? So on the atheist worldview, really, if taken to its proper conclusion, there can be no such absolute definition given to these sorts of words that we've got up on the screen right now: justice and mercy. There can be no objective value judgment of good, bad, evil, nice, or whatever you want to call it, on the atheist worldview. And yet we see their arguments proliferate today on these sorts of issues. And I don't think that's drawing a caricature, right? I don't think that's drawing a caricature at all. It's not sort of painting, atheism negatively, today's atheism negatively. I think it's actually, exactly what it is. So, questions of should and justice in a world without any meaning, right, which is what the natural conclusion of the atheist worldview would be, are meaningless. Right? They're meaningless. The atheists cannot come to the table with any such value judgments, and yet the atheists today, the militant ones anyway, are the ones at the forefront of asking these sorts of questions of people who ascribe to religions. Because the reality is that absent the existence of God, we are stuck in a very vicious cycle whereby if we try to use the word suffering in the world to make the point that God cannot exist, we are actually in a bit of a paradox. Right? And to illustrate, let me just look at two quick comments from well-known writers and philosophers on this particular point. And so Richard Taylor writes, Thus, even educated persons sometimes declare that such things as war, should be as war or abortion or the violation of certain human rights are morally wrong. And they imagine that they have said something true and significant. Educated people do not need to be told, however, that questions such as these have never been answered outside of religion. Questions such as this have never been answered outside of religion. Contemporary writers in ethics are really just weaving intellectual webs from thin air, which amounts to saying that they have discourse without meaning. Right? And that's the point, that if you don't have a moral framework, a pre-existing moral framework through which to start giving things value judgments, then notions of should, good, bad are completely just meaningless. And Richard Dawkins, the godfather of the modern militant atheist, when he said it, he said, to be honest, humans just, DNA floating around, changing over time through evolution, that's what we are. And so are morals, effectively, as a result of that, right? And Jean-Paul Sartre, again, very famous philosopher, doesn't need an introduction to most people. Moral values are either just expressions of personal or the byproduct of socio-biological evolution and conditioning. That's all they are. At any one point in time, what society believes will evolve because conditions will change and the human being will change in terms of their evolutionary trajectory, as it were. So this is why it's very important to recognize that when charges of God's impossibility of his very existence being predicated on the existence of suffering in the world, then we need to actually take a step back sometimes and interrogate those people who come to us with those charges, who come to us with that interrogation. And when they say, oh, look at this, look at all this evil, look at all this stuff that goes on, your God can't actually exist, right? Because to be honest, the best response is, what does evil and suffering mean anyway? What is hardship? It's just a set of material conditions that a person in X place is subjected to as opposed to in Y place. There's no way you can call that good or bad. Just like your body happens to register pain if you're in a certain physical state or a certain emotional state, and it sends neurological messages to through the rest of your body, registering certain feelings in your muscles and so forth. That's what pain is. That's all it is, right? And that's one way to sort of push back against this form of interrogation. So from that segue, let's come to what has become popularly known as the logical problem of evil, right? The logical problem of evil, which basically was, in the circles of philosophy, was largely dealt with by the end of the last sort of century, end of the 19th century, and scholars spent an inordinate amount of time on this and largely rebutted, I feel anyway, the contention that was made by those who forwarded this problem. And so, the fundamental problem with this particular argument is that it qualifies God a priori. Now, taking the gibberish away, what that means is that it says something about how God should be before the fact of investigating how he should be. Right? So you come to the discussion already having made up your mind about something that you actually should be investigating in the first place. Right? So if we are sincere to the inquiry of who is God, what are his attributes, what is his justice, what is his mercy, we should put all assumptions to the side, come to the table with as clean a slate as possible, and engage in this particular inquiry. Not sort of say, look, God should be this way. Oh, I don't find him that way, therefore he can't exist. Right? So that is making qualifications about God before the fact of actually engaging in the discussion. And the argument goes like this. The formal, logical, so-called problem of evil can be stated like this. Number one, to start with, hypothetically, an omnipotent, meaning an all-powerful, and omnibenevolent, meaning an all-merciful, God exists. That's the assertion. Number two, evil exists. And therefore, number three, God cannot or does not exist because of the fact of two. Right? So what it does is, what this argument is effectively saying is that, look, the assertion is that God exists, right? That's what your religious folk are saying. And you're saying that he's all-merciful and he's all-powerful and so forth. Okay, fine, let's look at that. But then we see this evil. And go back to Hume's argument, really that's what is firmly embedded here, is if he was omnibenevolent, if he was merciful, then he would end that suffering. And if he was omnipotent, he would have the ability to end that suffering. But on both counts, we see that evil exists and suffering exists, therefore God cannot possibly exist. Because you are the ones that said God is all-powerful, he's all-merciful. Right? That's the argument. And again, at a surface level, may strike some sort of intellectual chord in people who are not perhaps equipped at picking apart the arguments, but there's a hidden premise here. And the hidden premise, of course, is that if God is all-powerful and all-merciful, then he must create a world without evil. That's the hidden premise. That's what effectively is being said. That is the value judgment being made. That is the qualification being made of God a priori before you come to the discussion, come to the table with the discussion. And so therefore it becomes very important to take a step back and try to understand and pick apart the assumptions that exist here. And a variant of this particular argument is what we can call the logically probabilistic problem of evil, which is basically that if God exists, then it is reasonable that evil should not exist. And again, you'd have the same sort of response to it. And to both of them, whether it's the logical problem of evil or the probabilistic problem of evil, all we need to do, really, to destroy the argument is to show that there can be reasons, and good reasons, as to why evil and suffering exist in the world. That's all that needs to be done. And the argument comes crashing down. Right? And of course, there's a lot to be said about that. And we will say a lot about that. And then there's another one that I call the intuitive problem of evil, or the emotional problem of evil. And this is actually one, funnily enough, even though this one is better constructed, right? It's got formal syllogisms and so forth working through it. I actually have a lot more empathy for this one, right? Which is the emotional problem of evil, which is born out of the natural human experience of everyday life, which is simply, how can a merciful God let this happen? Right? You know, I mean, God, think of any sorts of incidents, that famous case that happened in Australia a decade or so ago, more, a car crashed through a daycare center, and I think it killed a couple of kids, and one kid was, badly, it was a very famous story, badly injured, did like all kinds of grafts in the hospital just next door, years and years of surgeries. Like, what did that kid do to deserve that? Pure little kid, playing in his childcare, bang, car, like literally, car comes out, flying through the window and the brick and mortar. Why would a merciful God let this happen? Right? And so it's often a protest against hardship. That's what it is. It's just a lived protest against lived hardship. Okay, and that's the sort of the more intuitive problem of evil. But again, if you can satisfy, and you can show that there can be good reasons why evil and suffering may exist and difficulty may exist, then you put head to this problem. And you actually go a long way to explaining that, well, not only is it understandable that evil can exist, actually it's, as we'll say by the end of today, as we will assert by the end of today, it's actually a function of God's mercy. And you're saying, oh my God, that's a step way too far, man. Like, okay, fine, it can exist, but you're saying it's a form of mercy. Well, that's obviously predicated on a certain logic and the Islamic view of viewing the world, which is what we'll get to very, very soon. So, a robust approach to this particular issue is one which comes with a framework around knowledge, right? You need that. And you need a way to determine knowledge and make normative value judgments. That's the only way we can deal with these sorts of issues, right? Meaning, you need to build knowledge in the correct way. You need to build knowledge in a rigorous way so that you don't fall victim to these sorts of ellipses and these sorts of hidden assumptions and so forth. And at the risk of getting very analytic in philosophical terms, which is a school of sort of modern day philosophy, there's continental philosophy, there's analytic. Analytic is sort of very dry, and it makes all these it's almost like the mathematical equivalent of philosophy, right? Everything is formulaic, everything is like this, and it leads to this. That's not what we're talking about here. These are very, very high level arguments that I'm making today, right? And so if you don't have background in philosophy, which most of us probably don't, try to engage, try to just stay with me, because it gets very, very easy in a moment. But really, what I mean by a framework of knowledge is that, there is a real problem. There is a real problem with everything, with every discussion being shoehorned with this notion of the existence of God, right? And so if you take this issue on a step-by-step sort of basis, then you can have each inquiry on its merits. And that's the really important thing, right? So if you've got a problem with the existence of God, then let's have the discussion about the existence of God, right? If that's the real issue, then let's have a discussion about the existence of God. Does he exist or not? Can he exist or not? Did this world pop up out of nowhere, or was there an all-powerful creator? And that discussion should be had on its merits. That should be the first discussion. If a person's problem is really the lack of existence of God, or the belief that there's no evidence for the existence of God, then let's have that discussion on its merits. But to in every discussion try to bring that through the back door is irrelevant. You can never get anywhere. You can never get anywhere in building a system, a framework of knowledge. But that discussion should be had on its own terms, right? And this particular issue of evil and suffering and so forth, that doesn't belong in that category of the existence of God. Does God exist? It comes further down the line. So if we had that discussion, and it should be had, and so for our non-Muslim friends here, or those who are here who doubt the existence of God because they just can't see it, how it works, Have that discussion explicitly. Have that inquiry on its own terms. Sure, you may be wondering how evil and so forth can exist in a world where God also, well, in a world that is created by God. We'll get to that. But it's something that should be done on its own merits. And then there is the question of, after that comes the question of the attributes of God. So how then, if we accept that God exists, do we go about finding out what are his attributes? Is he merciful? Is he vengeful? Is he angry? Is he smite, almighty smiter, as one of the, Bruce Almighty, that film, where God, he becomes God, doesn't he? Yeah. No, sorry. Yeah, he gets given the powers of God. He complains that he doesn't have everything in life, so God gives him certain powers, and so he thinks of God as this vengeful guy because he's got a mediocre middle class life, right? He's a newsreader who gets wet one day at the Niagara Falls, and so therefore his world comes crashing down and all that sort of stuff. So that's the evil and suffering that he encounters, and then he gets given the power of God, and he realizes how difficult it really is. What's God like? What are the attributes of God? And then, of course, how those attributes apply to any particular given discussion, right? Around justice, around mercy, around suffering, around evil, and all those sorts of things. But the point that I'm making, I guess, here is a robust approach would see us build knowledge one step at a time in a foundational sort of a way. And we need to separate these different elements and establish them on their own merits one at a time. So if the discussion is, does God exist? Let's have it on its very own merits. And Muslims, believers, do not run from that discussion. We're very open to having that discussion, right? So the question of mercy and evil is a separate discussion which we are having today. So let's pretend we have that discussion, and we have had that discussion. I'll just have a glass of water. God is merciful. Let's presume we've had that discussion, and God is established as existing, right? So after that, how do we go about establishing the attributes of God? How do we know what he is like? What are his characteristics? Right? So the attributes of God can be determined in one of two ways. These are the only two logical categories. There may be a third, but largely it's this. Rational, meaning you think about it, and you come to an intellectual sort of claim just by thinking about it, just the same way you would, like it's a truth that 1 + 1 = 2. Right? It's an intellectual exercise, and I could break it down into all sorts of categories of philosophical knowledge, but I'm keeping it high level for a reason. So there's rational and intellectual, and then there's textual, meaning you're told. Right? Textual means not literally text, you're told. Right? It's conveyed by someone to you what God could be. There could be a third, which is experiential. You could experience something, and that could be okay, that could become one. So that's the third category of potential. But largely those are the two possible big buckets through which you can go about inferring or knowing, the attributes of God. Now, rationally speaking, so the first of those, you can infer some attributes rationally or intellectually if you are convinced that he exists in the first place. So if you've answered that question and you've gone through the exercise and you've been to a Islamic Awareness Week talk and the Muslimics have convinced you that God exists, then next comes this question, right? But by the very fact of his existence, if he exists, certain attributes must be true for him. They must. Otherwise he wouldn't exist. And this world wouldn't exist. Right? By dint of that argument. And those are things like he must be very powerful. He must be capable of creation. He must have knowledge to be able to create what he's created. Right? These are some things which you can rationally conclude. Now, how knowledgeable, how powerful, is he all powerful, or does he have like 99% power? All that sort of stuff maybe you won't be able to determine rationally. But you'll get there, you get some big buckets right. Right? Including things like power and knowledge and creation and so on and so forth. But others, you will need some source of revelation, you will need some text, you will need someone to tell you what God is like. Right? And that, of course, is where revelation enters the picture, meaning the so-called the divine revelation. Right? So, let's say that our concern is with these particular attributes of mercy, of justice, of suffering, and all that sort of stuff. Where in the Islamic scheme of knowledge are those sorts of things determined? Well, taking a step back just to the last line, when I say we need texts and revelations for others, that is the case in every single knowledge system of the world that has ever existed, except for atheism. Right? When I say knowledge system, religions are just that. They are knowledge systems. They are systems which tell us this is how to live your life. This is what's true about this life and the hereafter. They make ontological claims, meaning they make claims about what is and is not. Those are knowledge systems, right? And so in some of those knowledge systems you have book X, in some of them you have book Y, in some of you have book Z. Right? But all of them contain some sort of revelation or set of commandments that have come down from God, received by one of his creations, prophets or messengers, and then passed down to the rest of humanity. Right? So obviously for Christianity, Jesus is all important. For Judaism, there was a range of prophets, but Moses is very important, and so on and so on and so forth. Okay? David is very important for Jews as well, etc. So the point is that each of the major knowledge systems of the world, and Hindus have their own, and Buddhists have their own, they have some sort of revelation to tell them about God, because we don't have access to that knowledge otherwise. We can only infer so much intellectually. And so our concern today is with the Islamic framework of knowledge, right? And that's what we're going to focus on. So in the Islamic schema of knowledge, there are a couple of sources for how we go about constructing our view of God, what God is like, what are his attributes, what are his characteristics. And they are largely the following. And again, don't want to get technical, don't want to get bogged down in 6 different categorizations. I'll keep it high level. So there is the Quran, which is the Word of God, the Book of God, which is our equivalent of say the Bible or the Old Testament. And then there is Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, may peace and blessings be upon him, which is also considered a source of revelation, what he says. Because we take it to be that he's divinely inspired with everything that he says pertaining to religious matters. Right? And then there is a rich scholarly tradition that stitches together those two things and distills it and lays out what is and is not, what should and should not be, and so forth. And there's some other sources of knowledge, such as the consensus of the companions of Prophet Muhammad and so on and so forth. But again, as I said, point is not to get detailed here. And then, based on those sources of knowledge, in order to answer this question, if there is, what's the topic of today? If God is merciful, why is there suffering? You need to build a few foundations based on these sources of knowledge. And they are the following. And that's the only way you can go in from today and answer this question of, if really God is merciful, then why is there suffering? What is the benefit of suffering? What is the logic behind suffering? This is a proposed framework for how that can be built once it's accepted that God exists. And again, if the question is about his existence, have that discussion on its own merit. So there is firstly the meaning of life. What does Islam have to say about the meaning of life? Right? Then there is the concept of life as a test, right? Which is different to the third point, right? Because tests can come in many different forms. It doesn't have to be personal suffering. Number 3, suffering as a function of this test. Okay? Number 4, patience as a provision. And number 5, suffering as a mercy. So I think those are the 5 main considerations that need to be made in order to be able to answer this question: if God is merciful, then why is there suffering? So with each of these, we're going to go through them, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through them, but I'm going to have on the slides a set of quotes from the Islamic tradition. So either from the Quran or from the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which convey in a very succinct way what Islam has to say about these issues. And they get straight to the point. No fluff, no mucking around. I've chosen the ones which I feel are the most direct and get straight to the core of the issues, and they say it much better than I could. Right? And that's why we'll focus on those. So what is the meaning of life in the Islamic epistemic, as it were, in the Islamic framework of knowledge? What is the meaning of life? So God says to us in various parts of the Quran. You can see here I make reference to different chapters of the Quran. You can look those up if you need to. He says, Allah says, God says, are you pleased with the life of this world rather than the hereafter? But little is the enjoyment of the life of this world as compared to the hereafter. He says, as compared with the life of the hereafter, the life of this world is nothing but a brief passing enjoyment. And the life of this world is nothing but play and amusement, but far better is the house in the hereafter. Truly, the life of this world is nothing but a quick passing enjoyment, and verily the hereafter is the home that will remain forever. Right? These are 4 succinct passages from the Quran which evince a basic point, which is what? That this life is not the goal. This life is not the objective, and there's something afterwards. Right? It's a simple point, but it's profound. It is profound. It can radically reshape everything that you have known about life if you've believed otherwise. That this life that you live, 60, 70, age expectancy, 80, going backwards these days, but let's accept that that's around 80 or whatever, that this life that you live and all that you do in it is tiny. Because on the macro scale of real life, let's say, the life of the world as opposed to the hereafter, what comes hereafter, Muslims consider that to be eternal. It just keeps going and going. And so what's in this life It's a precursor to what's to come. But, as God would have it, this life is tiny, is small in size, right? In the relative length that you spend, as opposed to the hereafter. And there's many other parables that are used in the Islamic tradition to highlight this particular point, which I have not put up there. But one of them is, for instance, that the life of this world compared to the life of the hereafter is like a drop of water in the ocean. So you can do the maths if you have Excel in front of you, because I don't think a calculator will be able to do the decimal points to the right of the zero. So the point is, it's very small, right? It's tiny, infinitesimally small. Okay, and that's the idea of life itself, right? The life of this world. That's the first foundation. Second foundation, life as a test, right? Life as a test. So God says in the Quran, verily, we shall put you to test with some fear and some hunger, with the loss of wealth, lives and offspring. And Muhammad, convey good tidings to those who are patient, who say when they are afflicted by hardship, verily we are of God, meaning we come from God, and verily to Him we shall return. And upon them is the blessing of God and His mercy. Right? What's that telling us? That is telling us that we will put you to test, through test and hardship. God is saying this, right? If again you accept God to exist, let's say for argument's sake you come to the conclusion that the Quran is the correct word of God, to the exclusion of other books like the Bible and so forth, then we will test you with fear and hunger and hardship and lives, meaning we will take lives away from those who are close to you, and your offspring. And we know very well that kids can be a huge test, and so forth. And wealth can be a huge test. How you spend it, how you don't, whether you have it or you don't, whether you have too little, whether you have too much. All of these things can be difficulties in life, right? God says in another chapter of the Quran, God will not leave the believers in the state in which you are now until He distinguishes the wicked from the good. Okay? He'll not leave you the way you are until He distinguishes the wicked from the good. How? By testing you and seeing your response, which is something that will make more sense in the next foundation that we go through. In another chapter of the Quran, He says, do you think that you will enter paradise before God tests those of you who fought in His cause, and also He tests those who are the patient? The point is not about fighting, rather it is those of you who strive in His cause, meaning who exert themselves in their cause, in His cause. Do you give up the comfort of your homes? And in this case, it is particular to the act of going out and defending the lands and spreading the message of God. But the emphasis could easily have been on anything else. Now, the point was, will you exert yourself in God's cause and make your life for Him, or will you just, be blasé about life? And continuing with some more, He says in another chapter, and know that your possessions and your children are but a trial, and that surely with God is the mighty reward. Meaning, if you dedicate yourself to God in this life, not to the exclusion of your children, but means following His commandments when it comes to your family, it is for those sorts of people that the reward is. But, all of your possessions and children are a trial. Okay? Meaning it's a test. Now, those who are not familiar with the Islamic discourse on these sorts of things may be wondering, well, what does that mean? Well, the meaning there is, what do you do with wealth? Do you hoard it? Do you save it for yourself, or do you give in charity? Do you spend it on worthwhile causes, and so on and so forth? So Islam has this big concept around everything that you've got, even if it's seemingly good and not earned through evil ways, it is a test. Because what you do with it is a test of your character. Whether you do good with it, whether you do evil with it, or not much, which in many cases you could consider that an evil because there is so much good to be done. God says, and we shall make a trial of you with evil and with good, and to us you will be returned. Meaning, we'll test you. We're going to test you. This is an examination, right? With good and with evil. With good and with evil. It's not just that evil is a test. It is also that good can be a test. I mean, Gina Reinhardt, she's got a test in front of her. Billions and billions of dollars. What do you do with that money? For those who have it, what do you do? Right? And sometimes, you hear these stories of Bill Gates is having trouble giving away all his money. Well, damn right, if you got that much money, what are you going to do with it? But the point is, if you happen to get that rich, if you happen to have that much of wealth, what do you do with it? Right? It becomes a test for you, it becomes a trial for you, it becomes a challenge for you. And God says in a fantastic passage of the Quran, do people think that on their mere claiming we have attained faith, they will be left to themselves and will not be put to test? Great verse of the Quran. Right? Surah Al-Ankabut, the chapter of the spider, is called, number 29, and the second verse of that chapter. Do people think they will say, I'm a believer, and that they will be left to themselves as they are without being tested? No. No way. And the verse afterwards, God actually says, وَلَقَدْ فَتَنَّ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ فَلَيَعْلَمَنَ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ صَدَقُوا وَلَيَعْلَمَنَّ الْكَاذِبِينَ. Verily we will test them, meaning these people who say we have believed. Verily we will test them like we tested those before them, to sift out and determine who are the truthful and who are the liars, to this claim of we have believed. Meaning what? That it is at the very essence of living and being alive, in this case as a Muslim, if you proclaim I'm a believer, that you will be tested. And that is the Islamic perspective towards life as a test. So that's the second foundation. First foundation is life is temporary, right? The meaning of this life is that life is temporary. Second is that life is a test, and you are going to be tested. If you are a believer, and you will be tested in some way, shape or form. Maybe not now, maybe things are really cruisy, but at some point you'll be tested. And honestly, I hate to delve into my personal experience, it's not the point, but my life is true of that. The most privileged, easy upbringing, best schools, great family, middle class life, had it all good. And I used to wonder, God's talking to me about tests and stuff, but and they came thick and fast beyond a certain point. They came, and that is the truth. That is the truth for everyone at some point in life, right? I've talked to so many people about this, and sometimes, especially when you're young, that doesn't really make sense because you've only lived for like 20, 25 years. You haven't been through the difficult parts of life where you would be tested. Because think of it this way. The more your footprint in life increases, the more the chances of something going wrong increase. But when you're single, ready to mingle, coming to uni, no relationships, just looking up yourself, your hardest decision every day is which coffee you buy, Compos or Victoria. Josh knows that very well. He struggles with that question every day. But that's the hardest thing in your life. But when you increase that footprint, right? When you've got a partner, hopefully in a halal way, to my Muslim friends, that means you're not in an illicit relationship. You've got a family, you've got a job. Things can start going wrong very easily, right? And so as you increase your footprint in life, something is bound to go not necessarily wrong somewhere, but for you to be challenged on account of something at some point. Because just the variables increase. It's just a mathematical calculation, right? And so anyone thinking that life will be all cruisy or as cruisy as you young university folk have it, then you're in for a shock, maybe a shock that you're ready for when you hear stuff like this, because it's bound to happen at some point, right? And so, what is suffering then? In the context of the topic that we have today, what is suffering? What is a test if it is not suffering? Right. So we use the words test before because that's the best rendering of the Arabic words that are found in the Quran that we're trying to approximate to convey what the Islamic tradition says about these sorts of things. But really, suffering is a test. Right. It's a test, meaning how will you confront that? How will you battle with that? And you don't have to be a believer to believe that, right? All these self-help books and life coaches these days that are sort of telling you if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger or something like that. You don't have to be a believer in God to believe that. It's a rational possibility. It's a logical question. You got a difficult situation in front of you, right, which is challenging. You can either be positive about it and try to make the best of it, or you can brood and not make the best out of it. Meaning it's a very binary sort of way to deal with things. So you don't need to be a believer to believe that. But when it comes to our Islamic tradition, it takes it to the next level, saying that life will be a challenge. Life will contain suffering, and so suffering is a form of being tested. And in the Islamic view of the world, it is not just a surprise. It should not be a surprise. It should not be an anomaly. It is rather something to be expected. Foundation 4. Now, in Islam's view, right, all of what I've said so far is a given now. Again, we're building one thing on top of another, right? So you will be tested, there will be challenging, therefore there will be challenges, therefore there will be suffering. That's a given. God has said that. It's going to happen, right? It is going to happen, right? Now, if it was just that, right, the case for, if God is merciful, why is there suffering? It still seems half-baked. It'd be like, all right, fine. But then, if you just stop there, in fact, if anything, the inquiry of the atheist or the inquiry of the person having doubts and faith because of difficulty would, if anything, be strengthened. Right? I mean, there is suffering. That's all you've established. Okay. Why did there need to be suffering? Why did God need to do this? You still haven't answered that question. So the next two foundations, as I've called them, are about that. Right? It's when you look at this all together that you end up with the picture that, wow, suffering, in the Islamic worldview, again, once you've established God exists and you've established the truth of the Quran and so forth, is actually a great blessing and is a form of mercy. Right? And so it's actually a function of God's mercy that suffering exists. And while that may seem so counterintuitive, it actually fits in so perfectly with this worldview that Islam has. We'll continue to build it and we'll see how we come out the other side. So, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, may peace and blessings be upon him, he informed us that the most severely tested people are the prophets of God, then the next best, then the next best. Right? Meaning the best people after the prophets are the most severely tested, and then the ones after is the grade. And a man will be tested, or a woman will be tested in accordance with his or her level of commitment to God. Right? Now you're starting to see what sort of how Islam views this, that a test in life is like a function of your level with God. And so obviously, if you take that as a truth, then your level of God will determine the difficulty that you fall into. And so naturally, those people who are higher in the eyes of God will be tested more because they're capable of bearing more. Right? God says, God is with those who are patient in adversity, meaning He comes closer to them as they are patient in the face of adversity. He says, only those who are patient in the face of tests and tribulation shall receive their rewards in full without limit. So we have this concept in Islam, on the Day of Judgment, everyone will be accounted. Right? It's like an examination, and God will sort of look at the good and the bad that you've done, and then He will make a decision as to whether you go to hell or you go to heaven. And in this particular case, there will be people who will receive their rewards in full, without any limit, and they will be those who, when they were confronted with difficulty, they were patient. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Prophet of Muhammad, he said, whoever persists in being patient, God will make him patient. And nobody can be given a blessing greater and better than patience. So now you can start seeing how this mosaic, this puzzle, this chessboard is starting to fill up, right? That, okay, fine, there will be suffering, there will be challenges, there will be difficulty, but the best weapon you've got in the face of it is patience and gratitude. Right? There's no blessing greater. So this incentivizes the person, the slave of God, the person, the human being, it incentivizes for them to push themselves to be patient. And as for whether that's just a natural attribute that people are born with or it's something that can be inculcated, it's another discussion, but suffice to say, you can choose to be patient. You can build it. It's like a skill. It's an attribute. It's something that through life and adversity can be learnt. And we all know this. I mean, that's why the self-help industry is so big, because there's some guy who's been through some difficulties telling everyone else through his, $5 a pop Facebook videos, why they can be patient and become better people and so on and so forth. So we know that intuitively that it's something that you can exercise control over and become better at doing. Furthermore, God says in the Quran, those will be rewarded, meaning those people who are patient will be rewarded with the highest place in paradise because of their patience. Therein they shall be met with greetings and the word of peace and respect by the angels who inhabit paradise. Right? And in another saying of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that the reward of being patient the reward of being patient while the true believer is afflicted with any kind of calamity and trials. The reward of being patient while the true believer is afflicted with any kind of calamity, disease. Sorry, there's a syntactical error there somewhere, but bear with me. The Prophet said, no fatigue, nor distress, nor sorrow, nor sadness, nor disease, nor hurt, nor distress will befall a Muslim, even if it were the prick that he receives from a thorn, but that God will expiate some of his sins for that. So there's another concept in Islam that if you go through hardship and difficulty, right, God offsets your sins and the wrongdoings that you do on account of that. It's like a balance, right? So if you've been a sinner, but at the same time you go through some challenge, God actually says, well, okay, he's going through some difficulty, and wipes away some of those sins. And that's incredible if you think about it. Right? Could be a person who's done a lot of wrong in life, and yet on account of difficulty, God is acknowledging that they're being put through challenges and tests and suffering, and that counterbalances what they have done of sin, and how that creates, in the eyes of God, a negative net balance, as it were, for that person. And finally, so before I go to that one, so patience as a provision. What are we saying here? We are saying that in the Islamic view of the world, challenges and trials and tribulations and suffering are a given. We actually view them as a given, not just that, as a promise from God, almost. In fact, yeah, you can use that. They are promised from God. You will suffer. You will face challenges because that is what it means to say, I believe. When you say, I believe, what does that mean? I believe in all of what God has said. I believe that this life is a test. I believe that this life is short. I believe that there is an afterlife. I believe that this life is a test of good, of character, of whether you do good or evil. I believe all of that. And so God is saying, remember that verse that we looked at from the Quran, that if you say that, then you will be tested. So it's a promise. Right? So Islam believes that suffering is a given in the world. It's not a surprise. It's not, the first world millennial wakes up one day and goes, oh my God, not so hard. No, that's how life is going to be. Right? That is how life is meant to be in the Islamic view of the world. But then there's a provision for that. Patience. And finally, to round out the picture, what if suffering itself was described explicitly as mercy? So, if you were to think of it from the Islamic perspective, this question of if God is merciful, why is there suffering? It's mind-boggling from the Islamic perspective. It's a paradoxical question. The statement Islam would make about this is, because God is merciful, there is suffering. And what a paradigmatic shift is that from how we have been influenced to think in society. Just think of how different that is to what the question is that's being asked there. But because God is merciful, there is suffering. And how does that work? So let's get a few things. And there's some stuff here which, as a Muslim, and those of us who are Muslim, you will read this, and if you haven't read these before, then they shake you, they rattle you on the inside. And if you're a non-Muslim and you're with us today, and you've seen this, then it'll help you see why, as Muslims, we view life so differently. Why our priorities are so different. That if all of what we've said so far is true, if God exists, if Islam is true, then how all of that shapes one's view of the world in a very, very different fashion. So let's get that to round it out. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, the Prophet of Allah said, Prophet of God said, if God intends good for someone, He afflicts him with trials. Right? With suffering. In another narration he said, if God loves a people, then He afflicts them with trials. Whoever is patient has the reward of patience, and whoever is impatient has the fault of impatience. In another one, he said, a servant, meaning human being, will be rewarded on the day of judgment for supplications to God, even the ones that have not been answered. And the reward will be so great that he wishes that his supplications had never been answered. Because again, there's a bit of contextual knowledge that needs to know for this, that sometimes when a human being asks God something, he prays, right? God may choose not to answer his prayer in this world. And when that is the case, he is rewarded with something greater in the hereafter, on the day of judgment. He's rewarded with a great reward, right? So God is like, I withheld that from you in this life, I'm going to recompense you with interest in the next life, right? Like manifold greater. Interest is disallowed in Islam, but I'm using it metaphorically. And so that disproportionality between the reward of the next life compared to this life is so great that the person will wish on the day of judgment, I wish none of my prayers had been answered in that life. I don't care. The reward of seeing this in this life is so much greater that I'd wish nothing had been answered. We ask for all sorts of things as Muslims. We ask for all sorts of material things, physical things. Oh God, let me do well in my exams. Oh God, give me a beautiful wife or husband. Oh God, give me fantastic children. Oh God, give me an easy life. Give me a great job. Give me a Merc, whatever it is, right? Whatever floats your boat. You ask, and God gives you. In many cases, you get what you want, right? And of course, as Muslims, we believe that is a function of God answering our prayers. But in many cases, He doesn't. And we believe that He reserves it for the next life. But this narration from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's telling us that the reward in the hereafter for things that are withheld in this world is so great that you'll wish you didn't have any of your prayers answered in this world. Which is pretty incredible to think about. Really incredible. Because there's some stuff I really want in this life that I'm making dua for every day. And the thought that in the next life I would stand there in front of God and say, whoa, I wish you hadn't given that to me is pretty mind-boggling. Which shows you where the emphasis is in Islam, tilted towards the hereafter, and how it views this life as like this temporary little thing. You're being tested, make sure you do the right thing, because the real pleasure will be there. Furthermore, there's a famous narration of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, wondrous is the affair of the believer, for there is good for him or her in every matter, and this is not the case with anyone except for the believer. Right? Meaning it's not the case for those who don't believe, who don't have this ethos in life. If he is happy, then he thanks God, and thus there is good for him, because you're thanking God, you're showing gratitude. And if he is harmed, then he shows patience, and thus there is good for him, because patience is rewarded so greatly, as we learnt in the previous foundation. The Prophet further said that whoever God wants good for, He puts him to test. He puts them through difficulties, like a diamond or some metal that has to be burnt, and then that which is bad from it is removed, so that you have that which is pure diamond, pure gold, or so forth. He puts them to tests, trials, and difficulties. Right? That's a great analogy of like the impure gold that is having the impurities removed from it until it is left in a pure sort of condition. And finally, this for me is the most incredible of these sayings, that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he said, when the people, the afia, meaning those who are safe from trials in this world, right? Relatively speaking, everyone goes through something, but those who are safe from major trials and difficulties in this world see what the people that were trialed in this world, the dunya means world, in this world, in the temporary abode in which we live, when they see what the people of difficulty are given by God in terms of rewards, they will wish that their skins were sliced up by scissors in this world, in the life of this world. Right? Now, no one wants their skins to be sliced up by scissors, but it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for when they see the greatness of the reward of those who were tested with difficulties here, who were challenged, and who had patience and believed and persevered. Right? Then they will wish that they were sent back to the world, sliced up and diced up, because the reward of challenges and tests is so great in the hereafter. And that is the concept of suffering as a mercy. Because what it does is it cleanses you for great reward in the next life. Right? It's again that metaphor of purification, of the removal of impurities, of the removal of sins even. Right? From your account. Say you're a normal human being who sins, does good, does bad, is negligent, is good sometimes, is bad sometimes. So you've got some bad stuff in your bank account, right? Through difficulties and suffering, and you showing patience in their face, God removes that and bumps your account up in good so much that on the Day of Judgment, you are rewarded manifold. Right, so that is Islam's view of how suffering can be mercy. How it's a mercy, because in the grand picture, the big picture, which is what you have to view life as, it's a tiny component of a much bigger eternal life, it really is the case that whatever test and tribulation, challenge and suffering you experience in this life, you get recompense for the other side. Right? And so, if we do a summary, or if we sort of look at today's discussion in the context of where we started, right? Not only can you see that there are very good reasons now for why God may test someone, right? But that perseverance in the face of those tests is a cause for people to be elevated. Is a cause for people to be elevated. So coming back to the question, if God is merciful, why is there suffering? Well, there's suffering because God has designed this world. He has designed the world in a certain way. There's a certain outlook towards this life versus the hereafter that He wants us to have, and He has promised that He will test and create suffering for us as a challenge to see how we respond. And there are many incidental benefits which we haven't even discussed, those which we can think of. It makes you a stronger person, it makes you more grateful, it makes you appreciative of how easy you have it compared to other people. There's so many reasons we can come up with for the benefits of being tested and trialed. Right? But this at the core of it is why there is suffering. Right? And of course there's many iterations of questions that we can ask in response, which I'll probably leave to the Q&A session, in terms of, okay, fine, that all sounds really cool, good stuff, Islamics, but what did the sub-Saharan African kid do to have this suffering? You still haven't answered my question, right? Okay, cool. For the average person, who's got limbs and a mind and a heart and is ready to plow through the test of life, that makes sense. But what about all the suffering that goes on? These diseases that afflict these people who've never had the chance to even learn all this stuff, right? Let alone apply it and be of those who come out the other side stronger. What about them? The response is simple. Again, it's a bit of a detailed discussion, but there are certain rules, as it were, or certain prescriptions of Islam, or certain knowledge that we've been conveyed by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and Allah, God, that tell us about the station of such people. People or children who die before they reach a certain age, straight to paradise. Right? People who are tested and die in a certain way, straight to paradise. People on top of whom buildings collapse, believers of course, straight to paradise. People who die of stomach ailments and cancers and stuff like that, straight to paradise. Right? These sorts of things. Right? That for so many of the things which we know of that people are afflicted by, that actually is a shortcut to paradise, and it cuts through all all the challenges and difficulties the rest of us will have to face when we confront God and we are accounted for the good and bad that we do. So there's a lot of detail there, which you can't go into today. All the different iterations of what about this person, that person, that person, that person. We can discuss that in the Q&A. But by and large, I guess the point that I'm making is that there's a lot to be said around that, and Islam has this comprehensive view of how different people who've done different things, who are at different stages of life, and they pass away and they die and they suffer and so forth, it has something to say about all of that. And so taken as a whole, I think, we're reasonably well placed to say that it is because God is merciful that there is suffering. Otherwise there would be no point to life at all. Right? If everything was hunky-dory, life would not be a test. And really, only truly then could we say in response, why did God have to create any of this? But the reason he created it is to test us, is to put us through the challenge that is life, to see how we respond and what we are deserving of and worthy of in the next life. So that is why there is suffering, and that is with what we will conclude the formal part of my talk, and we will see if there's any questions and so forth. So that's it from my side, and over to you guys now.